The morning started like any other. I sat on my grandmother's century-old porch swing, sipping my coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft pinks. The purple trim of my beloved Victorian home stood out against the morning light, a color my grandmother had chosen with love decades ago. That was when I spotted her, Karen Thompson. She was power walking toward my mailbox, an envelope clutched in her manicured hands like it was made of gold. I'd seen that look before. The same determined expression she wore at the neighborhood meetings she had started hosting in her newly renovated McMansion next door. My stomach tightened. She lingered after dropping the envelope in my mailbox, making sure to take photos of my front yard with her phone. My grandmother's roses were in full bloom, their wild beauty a stark contrast to Karen's perfectly trimmed boxwood hedges. I knew she hated every unruly petal. When I opened the envelope, I felt my hands shake. It contained what she called an exciting opportunity, a formal invitation to join their newly formed HOA. The glossy brochure showcased identical beige houses with matching mailboxes, a vision of uniformity Karen was determined to impose. The membership fee was $5,000, with monthly dues of $350. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached was a list of mandatory property modifications. Remove all non-approved paint colors, including my grandmother's beloved purple trim. Replace the heritage rose garden with approved vegetation. Take down the antique wind chimes that had sung me to sleep since childhood. Through my window, I watched Karen walk back to her house, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I just delivered the final invitation," she said, her voice carrying that fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. "She'll have to join now. Her house is the last holdout on the street. Once we get her property in line, this neighborhood's value will skyrocket." That evening, I walked to Karen's house with the invitation in hand. The second I pressed her doorbell, a chiming version of "We Are the Champions" echoed through the house. Of course it did. Karen answered the door wearing a neighborhood watch captain badge, her lips stretched in what I assume was meant to be a welcoming smile. "I've reviewed your invitation," I said calmly. My years of professional experience kept my voice steady. "I need to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to preserve its historic character." Her smile vanished faster than free cookies at a bake sale. "You don't understand," she said, stepping forward, her tone dropping into something sharper. "This isn't really an invitation. The HOA has already been registered. Your property is surrounded by HOA members. You have to join." I pulled out the property maps I had researched that afternoon. "Actually, that's incorrect," I replied. "My deed predates any HOA agreements. I have no legal obligation to join." 20 years of legal experience had taught me to always do my homework. Karen's face turned an interesting shade of red. "Listen here," she hissed, the fake niceness vanishing completely. "This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult. Accidents happen to houses that don't meet code. Citations get filed. Fines add up." I met her gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson?" She stepped back, sugary smile returning. "Of course not," she said, voice dripping with artificial concern. "I'm just worried about your property values. And safety, of course. Old houses like yours can be so unpredictable. Electrical problems, structural issues. It would be terrible if something happened because you refused to modernize." Behind her, I caught movement, a shadow in the window. Her husband, Bob, watching through the glass, phone in hand. Something about his stance made me uneasy. I nodded politely and turned to leave. "1 week," Karen called after me. "You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options." As I walked home, I noticed new faces watching from their windows. Karen's HOA allies, no doubt. Something told me this wouldn't end with a simple, declined invitation. That night, I installed security cameras around my property, making sure to document everything. I had learned long ago to trust my instincts, and right now they were screaming that Karen Thompson was just getting started. The next morning, I was greeted by the shrill voice of Karen Thompson outside my window. "Look at those hideous purple trims. They're destroying our property values." Peeking through my curtains, I saw Karen leading a group of HOA members on what they called their morning inspection. My heart sank as I watched them photograph every inch of my grandmother's beloved home. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, trying to ignore their whispers. Did you see those ancient wind chimes? They're not HOA approved. And those roses, Barbara, Karen's sidekick, gasped dramatically. They're 3 inches taller than regulation. Every day the complaints grew more ridiculous. Bright orange warning letters started appearing on my front door. The Heritage Rose Garden, once a neighborhood gem, was suddenly labeled a nuisance. The authentic Victorian purple trim, once photographed by tourists, had now become their biggest target. One Tuesday morning, I walked outside to find Karen and Barbara measuring my grass with a ruler. 11.5 inches, Karen announced triumphantly, while Barbara scribbled furiously in a notebook. That's 3.5 inches over code. I took a slow sip of my coffee. You're trespassing on private property. My voice was firm, controlled. I knew my legal rights, but I kept my profession private. Karen smirked, taking more photos. The harassment escalated. Every Saturday morning at exactly 7 a.m., landscapers showed up, uninvited, conveniently using their loudest equipment right outside my bedroom window. Anonymous complaints to code enforcement became a weekly event. Each time I met the officials with a calm smile and handed them my historic status documentation. From her window I could see Karen fuming. Then came the psychological warfare. Karen organized HOA meetings in her driveway, right outside my home office window. The topic? Some people are bringing down the neighborhood's reputation. Certain houses need to be dealt with, for everyone's good. Karen and her allies tested my patience in petty ways. They let their dogs use my yard as a bathroom, then feigned shock when I showed them security footage. "Oh, my precious Bentley would never," Karen gasped, clutching her pearls, as her massive golden doodle left another present on my lawn. The breaking point came during their annual block party. I wasn't invited, of course, but I could hear Karen, voice raised just enough for me to hear. "Some older properties," she said, glancing at my house, "just don't fit our community vision anymore." That's when I noticed people taking photos of my home's foundation, whispering about structural concerns. I stayed calm. I documented everything. Each letter, every photo, all the anonymous complaints. I filed them methodically. When they installed bright security lights aimed at my bedroom windows, I added light pollution violations to my growing evidence file. My grandmother had taught me patience, so as I watched Karen's group grow bolder, I knew timing would be everything. That night, as I reviewed my security footage, I caught something disturbing. 2 HOA board members were examining my property line markers, whispering about easement regulations. I recognized that look. They were planning something bigger, but what they didn't know was that I'd spent my career dealing with people who thought they were above the law. As I turned off my porch light, watching Karen's group huddle in her driveway, I wondered, how long should I wait before showing them exactly who they were messing with? I never expected to find Karen Thompson and 2 HOA board members skulking around my property at midnight. But there they were. I had woken up thirsty and gone to my kitchen for a glass of water when I saw them through the window, illuminated by my security lights. My breath caught in my throat. They were holding chemical sprayers, pointed directly at my grandmother's century-old rose garden. I grabbed my phone and hit record before stepping onto the porch. "What do you think you're doing?" My voice was calm, but my hands clenched at my sides. Karen jumped, but quickly recovered, a fake smile spreading across her face like poison. "Oh, we're just helping eliminate these invasive species," she said sweetly, continuing to spray my roses. "The HOA has strict rules about non-native plants. If you just join us, we could handle these issues properly." I stepped closer, my blood boiling but my voice steady. "Those aren't invasive species, Karen. They're heritage Victorian roses, planted by my grandmother in 1960. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, but Karen stood her ground. "Well," she sniffed, adjusting her designer pajamas, "someone complained about the smell and these thorns, a safety hazard for children walking by." I gestured at my clearly marked property line. "Behind my fence? On my private property?" I challenged, switching on my security lights. "You're trespassing." That's when Bob, Karen's husband, stepped out of the shadows. Now, he said in a patronizing tone, "let's not throw around accusations. We're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. Nobody wants to live next to a jungle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement across the street. Mrs. Watson, my elderly neighbor, was peeking through her curtains. She had been bullied into joining the HOA last month after similar late-night visits. Her beautiful rock garden had been ripped up within days, replaced with HOA-approved generic shrubs. I turned back to Karen. "You have 5 seconds to leave before I call the police," I said. Karen smirked, but there was something else in her eyes now. Hesitation. Bob shifted uncomfortably. One of the other board members nudged him, muttering something under his breath. Without another word, they turned and left, their sprayers still dripping with chemicals. I watched them go, my heart pounding, knowing this wasn't the end. The next morning, when I stepped outside the following morning, my stomach dropped. The once vibrant roses, the same ones my grandmother had spent decades cultivating, were blackened and shriveled. Dead. I knelt beside them, running my fingers over the wilted petals. Karen had made a crucial mistake. She had unknowingly revealed the HOA's pattern, their methodical targeting of specific homeowners, and I had proof. That afternoon, I went to the county records office. What I found made my hands shake. Every house that had initially refused to join the HOA had suffered mysterious accidents or code violations until they sold. I went home and installed high-definition security cameras, hiding them carefully among my remaining plants. That evening, I saw Karen leading a group of potential buyers past my property. "Of course this eyesore will be dealt with soon," she announced loudly. "We have ways of handling difficult residents." The harassment escalates. The following week was a nightmare. My mailbox was knocked over 3 times. Anonymous complaints were filed against me for noise violations, on days I wasn't even home. Code enforcement officers started showing up daily, finding nothing but returning anyway. My garbage bins disappeared, only to be found in violation of HOA rules. I documented everything, meticulously building my case. But Karen's group grew bolder. They started hosting HOA meetings in front of my house, pointing out every perceived flaw to potential new residents. "This property is driving down home values," Karen declared one evening, waving her designer handbag for emphasis. "But don't worry, it won't be a problem much longer." The final straw came when my security cameras caught them tampering with my historic fence posts, loosening them while pretending to measure the sidewalk. The footage showed Karen instructing her minions. "Once these posts fail inspection, she'll have to replace the whole fence with our approved model. That'll cost her thousands. Unless she joins the HOA, of course." That night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something strange. The HOA's so-called inspection team was always photographing my electrical boxes, gas lines, and other utilities. They were documenting every potential vulnerability of my home. But why? The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they formed sent a chill down my spine. I knew I needed to act fast, but I couldn't reveal my hand too soon, because what I didn't know then was that Karen had already set in motion a plan that would change everything, a plan that would bring all my worst fears blazing to life. The morning started with a headline that made my blood run cold. "Corrupt CEO sentenced to prison by federal judge Sarah Martinez." The courtroom had been dead silent when my clerk, Emily, burst through the doors, her face ghost white. "Your Honor, your house," she gasped. "It's on fire." I froze, then I ran. 15 minutes, that's how long it took to drive home. But I saw the black smoke rising from 3 blocks away, and my stomach turned to ice. By the time I arrived, my beautiful Victorian home, the same house that had been in my family for 3 generations, was an inferno. The purple trim, the carved wooden porch, the century-old beams, all devoured by flames. I could barely breathe as I stepped out of my car. Firefighters were battling the blaze, their shouts barely audible over the roaring flames. The heat hit me like a wall, and I could hear the wood groaning under the assault of fire and smoke. Everything my grandmother had built, everything I had fought for. And then I saw her, Karen Thompson, standing in her driveway, coffee cup in hand, wearing designer yoga pants like she was watching a morning show. She was smiling, not even trying to hide it. Around her, HOA board members whispered and pointed at my burning home. And that's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. The cover-up fire chief Martinez approached me, his face grim. "Ma'am, it looks like an electrical fire. These old houses, their wiring can be dangerous." But I knew better. Just yesterday I had my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code. I had made sure of it, especially after Karen's repeated threats about unsafe historic properties. Then another thought hit me like a punch to the gut. My security cameras. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, trying to access the footage. Blank. The cameras had mysteriously stopped recording at 3 a.m., exactly 4 hours before the fire started. This was no coincidence. And then I noticed something else. Bob Johnson and Mike Peters, two HOA board members, trying to blend into the crowd of concerned neighbors. But their shoes caught my attention. Work boots. The same distinctive boots I had seen on my security footage last week when my rose bushes were vandalized. Now those boots were covered in fresh mud. Or was it ash? Karen's fatal mistake. As I stood there watching my home burn, memories flashed through my mind. Baking cookies in that kitchen with Grandma, celebrating my law school graduation in the garden, hearing the wind chimes sing me to sleep, and now it was all gone, because I refused to bow to Karen's HOA dictatorship. I turned back to Karen. She was texting someone. Seconds later, I overheard a neighbor say, "There's a fantastic deal on premium land that just got listed." My jaw locked. Karen hadn't just burned my house. She had already planned the sale of my land. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me. But she had made one crucial mistake. She didn't know who she was dealing with. The call for justice. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. One to my friend at the FBI, one to my contact at the state attorney's office, one to a private investigator I trusted. Karen was still watching me, sipping her coffee, that smug expression never leaving her face. But when she saw me making those calls, something flickered in her eyes. Doubt. For the first time, she looked nervous. She didn't know who I was calling, but something in my stance, in my silence, must have worried her. Good. Let her worry. Because while my house lay in ruins, my real power had nothing to do with property, and everything to do with justice. The promise. As the sun rose higher in the sky, I knelt in the ashes of my home. My fingers brushed against a small charred piece of purple trim. Grandma had always said, "Sometimes you have to lose everything to gain the strength to fight back." I looked back at Karen's smug face, and for the first time I smiled. She thought this was over, but she had just lit the match to her own destruction. I made a promise to myself. I was going to tear down everything she built, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. 6 months. That's how long it took to dismantle Karen's empire. 6 months of careful planning, of following the money, of exposing the corruption that had plagued my neighborhood for years. Karen had burned my house to the ground, thinking she could erase me. Instead, she had set fire to her own kingdom. The unraveling. My first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Karen's former HOA treasurer reached out to my lawyer. Over coffee in a quiet diner 2 towns away, she handed me a USB drive with 5 years of HOA financial records. Her hands trembled as she explained how Karen had forced her to cook the books, threatening to expose her undocumented status if she refused. The documents showed hundreds of thousands of dollars in mysterious cash deposits. Deposits made right after every accidental fire in the neighborhood. I spent sleepless nights connecting the dots. Karen's husband, Bob, hadn't just retired from the police force. He had been the lead fire investigator in every single case of suspected arson in our county. Each fire had been ruled an accident. Each homeowner had been forced to sell for pennies. Each property had been bought by the same shell company. And who owned that company? Karen's sister-in-law. The smoking gun. My investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Karen had done this before. 3 other historic neighborhoods had suffered the same fate. She would move in, form an HOA, and bully residents into compliance. If that didn't work, vandalism, harassment, mysterious fires. Once the homes were gone, she would sell the land to developers for millions. The FBI sting. With the FBI's help, we wired up the former treasurer for a meeting with Karen. The recording captured everything. Karen laughing about her next targets, Karen joking about which houses might have electrical problems. Karen threatening to make the treasurer disappear if she ever talked. The final piece fell into place when I discovered why Karen targeted my home specifically. Deep in city archives, I found an old map, a planned highway expansion. Karen's developer friends had inside information. My property was key to their plan for a new shopping complex. They had already bought the surrounding land through shell companies, but without my house, their entire multi-million-dollar project would fail. The final showdown. The HOA meeting that night was packed. Karen strutted to the front of the room, stack of papers in hand, ready to announce that my burned-out property had been declared a public nuisance. "Any objections?" She smirked, scanning the room. I stood up. "I object, Mrs. Thompson." Silence. All eyes turned to me as I walked down the aisle, my heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Karen's smirk flickered for just a second. "Well, well," she sneered. "Come to finally admit defeat?" I pulled a thick folder from my bag and spread photographs across the table. My security footage of her board members on my property, the night of the fire, emails discussing plans to force out non-members, bank records linking her to suspicious property sales, text messages about making my electrical fire look accidental. The room erupted in gasps. Karen's hands started shaking, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. "These could be anyone," she snapped. "You can't prove—" I pulled one last thing from my bag, my judicial robes. As I slipped them on, I said, "Federal Judge Sarah Martinez, presiding over case number 2025 C.R. 142, United States v. Thompson et al., a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy." Karen went pale. Her coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. At that moment, the doors burst open. "FBI, nobody move!" Agents swarmed the room. Karen's husband tried to run. He didn't make it 3 steps before being tackled. I walked up to Karen, who had collapsed into her precious president's chair, staring in shock. "You know what the biggest mistake criminals make?" I asked. She didn't answer. "They get so caught up in their own power, they forget to check who they're really dealing with." I picked up her fallen gavel, the same one she had used to sentence my home to destruction. I slammed it down on the table. Meeting adjourned. Justice served, the trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. One by one, victims of Karen's HOA took the stand. Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher, who lost her family photos in a suspicious garage fire. The Patel family, whose grandfather's ashes were destroyed. Dozens of homeowners, bullied into selling for pennies on the dollar. When the verdict was read, my voice didn't shake. Karen, 25 years. Her husband, 15 years. Each HOA board member, 15 years. Karen tried to protest, but I cut her off, the same way she had dismissed me so many times before. Justice had arrived. The rebirth. 6 months later, I stood in my garden, watching construction workers finish rebuilding my Victorian home. The purple trim was exactly as my grandmother had painted it. The rose garden had been replanted with cuttings from the one surviving bush. Karen's McMansion, sold to pay victim compensation. A lovely immigrant family lived there now. They had no HOA, just a real community. We held block parties in my garden, everyone bringing food and sharing stories. Yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas, showing me family photos her daughter had managed to restore. The local news ran a story about how our neighborhood had transformed. They interviewed the Patels, who now hosted our monthly meetings in their beautiful backyard. The lesson: I keep Karen's coffee cup on my desk at the courthouse, the same one she dropped when she realized who I was. It reminds me of something my grandmother always said. Justice may take the long road, but it always arrives at the right destination. And every morning, I sip my own coffee in my rose garden, watching the sunrise through my perfectly purple-trimmed windows, knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply rebuilding something more beautiful than what was destroyed.